Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to the event that the Korea Studies program is hosting, a conversation with U.S. senior official for APEC, Matt Murray, creating a resilient and sustainable future for all. As Austin said, I'm Mian Oh, Director and Senior Faculty Lead of the Korea Studies here at SAIS, my alma mater, and I'm really honored to have and host Ambassador Murray to learn about his new role and the mission of the State Department as the U.S. government is hosting the APEC summit this year, as you know. This event is on the record and open to the SAIS community. And we will have Ambassador Murray on the stage shortly to hear his remarks, and then we'll open up the floor for Q&A sessions. And there will be about 30-minute networking session, as Austin mentioned. So please stay and really appreciate Ambassador Murray for kindly agreeing to stay with the student. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ambassador Matt Murray. So Matt was appointed as the U.S. senior official for the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC, in February 2022. In his role, he coordinates U.S. participation in APEC and also oversees the Office of Economic Policy in the State Department's Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Prior to his current assignment, Matt led the State Department's Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs as senior bureau official from August 2021 to January 2022. And he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Trade Policy and Negotiations from September 2020 to August 2021. And Ambassador Murray has also focused on, U.S. economic engagement with the Asia-Pacific region throughout his State Department career, including as Minister Counselor for Economic Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, Counselor for Economic Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Canberra, and Special Assistant for East Asian and Pacific Issues in the Office of the Undersecretary for Economic Growth, Energy, and Environment. And he's a senior foreign service officer. I know many of you are also pursuing that career track. So please feel free to ask questions as well. And I'm really looking forward to his remarks. So now, Ambassador Murray, the floor is over to you. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Dr. O, for the introduction. Great to see you all. I know you have lots of other things that you could be doing right now, having lunch, studying, doing other stuff. So really appreciate the time. And it's great to have the opportunity to talk a bit about our APEC host year. And just by a show of hands, who has some familiarity with APEC, what it is, what it does, what it's been doing? Okay, a couple of very hesitant hands raising. That's fine. That's why we're here. But it's terrific to be back at SAIS. Not my first visit. I've met with students here before. It's always great to have that opportunity. I also, as Dr. O said, I know that in many cases you all are going to be future colleagues as well. I had two interns from SAIS when I was at the U.S. consulate in Shanghai a little over 10 years ago, who are now very successful foreign service officers at the State Department. It's always great to run into them and reminisce back to their intern days. I also had the opportunity to spend a lot of time at the SAIS Center at Nanjing University, back when I was at the consulate in Shanghai. So always great to be here, and especially, for all of you as future leaders in public service and other walks of life to be able to talk about our regional economic engagement. But we are going to focus a bit on APEC today, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. And, APEC goes back, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, but it goes back to 1989. And, this year is the third time that we'll be hosting APEC in the United States. And so I'll talk a little bit about what that means and what APEC is. I do want to say at the top, though, that would emphasize that APEC is not the only thing the administration's doing on regional economic policy in the Asia-Pacific or the broader Indo-Pacific. And our office, does work on broader regional economic policy. So I'm also happy to talk today about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. I'm happy to talk about the Quad and the things we're doing there. I'm happy to talk about all the different ways in which we engage Korea in regional economic discussions, whether it's APEC or whether it's on supply chains or whether it's on IPEF. And so happy to work through those things as we get to the question and answer towards the end. But one of the really great privileges to being U.S. senior official for APEC, especially since we're hosting, is that I get to go out and meet with a lot of audiences here in the United States, whether that's here in Washington or last week, Sue and I were in Atlanta, the week before we were in Pittsburgh. And then as you'll hear, we're hosting APEC meetings around a lot of different cities in the United States. And so that's really a great opportunity because it's this place where there's this nexus between being a foreign policy professional and having done this for 25 years, but really in a very, in a very real way, being able to demonstrate to domestic audiences or to, Americans here as well as folks from the region who are here in the United States, that we're trying to do our part to really be a leader in the region, but also grow our economy here at home and grow the region's economies. Secretary Blinken last year at the APEC Summit ministerial meeting in November talked about how we want to use APEC and regional economic engagement more broadly to really meet the moment that we're in. We've all been through these challenges with the COVID pandemic, with economic headwinds, with a lot of the different things that we're all facing around the region. So with that, I want to get into what APEC is and how we can use it as a platform to advance this sort of meet the moment goal. So APEC was launched in 1989 as a consensus-based, non-binding economic organization with members on both sides of the Pacific Rim to promote economic and trade cooperation, not only between governments, but also importantly with input from a broad array of stakeholders, particularly the private sector. So in 1993, 30 years ago, during the first US host year, APEC was also elevated to a leaders level forum. So now every year since 1993, we've had leaders from the 21 economies, meet in November usually. And then President Clinton hosted the first APEC leaders meeting in Blake Island, Washington, near Seattle in 1993. So APEC has been a forum where economies have gathered to address many of the key economic policy challenges over the past 3 decades. And so I first learned about APEC as an intern myself in Indonesia back in 1995. 1 year after Indonesia had hosted APEC. So in the pre-internet days, I had a whole stack of old magazine articles I was supposed to read about Indonesia. Not surprisingly, in 1995, there weren't a whole lot of articles about Indonesia in the US press. But what there were in like The Economist and a magazine, an old magazine called the Far Eastern Economic Review, they were all about basically Indonesia just having hosted this relatively new forum called APEC. At which time they had launched something called the Bogor Goals, which was about really trying to work towards more open trade and investment regimes around the region. And so that was sort of my first, experience with, just with the region at all, but really being there in 1995 and seeing it as a very up and coming, economically dynamic place. This was, I was sold, like that's where I wanted to spend most of my career. And I later had the opportunity to work on APEC again during my experience working for Undersecretary Hormats here in Washington when we hosted APEC in 2011 and also when during the 2012 year. And when the United States hosted APEC in 2011, we made progress on a couple of very important agenda items. We launched new work on women's economic empowerment because recognizing that women's economic participation as full participants in the economy is really important for economic growth around the region, including here in the United States. We also launched some new work on green growth, which we've then followed up, and I'll talk more about what we're doing today on environmental issues, as well as regulatory convergence and economic integration. And so from these opportunities, I learned, that APEC, like other multilateral initiatives that you will have heard of, like the G20 and the G7 and the East Asia Summit, could be an excellent platform to address economic challenges on a multilateral basis, but also importantly, a great convener to bring leaders, to bring ministers, to bring other officials together to be able to meet bilaterally and solve problems. I lost mine, okay. So in recent years, I want to cover some of the things that have happened in APEC. But today, the 21 APEC economies account for half of global trade and approximately 60% of GDP. And so for the United States, the APEC region accounts for 60% of total exports and consists of 7 of our top 10 trading partners. And as you saw on the previous slide, the organization's membership includes some of our closest partners like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, as well as emerging economies like Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia, and Latin American partners like Chile and Peru, as well as some economies where we have difficulty, like China and Russia. APEC also is one of the few multilateral organizations where Taiwan participates as a full member under the name of Chinese Taipei. The APEC calendar, which I'll get into greater detail in a minute, provides opportunities to engage with all of these economies at multiple levels over the course of more than 300 meetings each year, including workshops with subject matter experts, senior officials like myself, ministerial meetings, as many as 10 of those, as well as the leaders meeting, and includes key opportunities for collaboration between the public and private sector, including an APEC CEO summit during Leaders Week. Our office, where Sue and I work at the State Department, coordinates this work across the interagency, as more than a dozen U.S. departments and agencies are engaged in delivering outcomes through each year-long process, including engaging relevant stakeholders. And so while our office has been very busy over the last few years, again, with the hesitant hands that went up at the beginning, you could be forgiven if APEC has been a little bit out of sight, out of mind the last few years, because as has been the case for all of us and for every single thing that we've all worked on, COVID kind of changed a lot of that, as everything for APEC had to go online in early 2020, and we didn't get back to in-person meetings until sort of middle of the year in 2022. So in 2020, Malaysia was the host of APEC. They launched something called the APEC Putrajaya Vision for an open, dynamic, resilient, and peaceful Asia-Pacific community by 2040. And then the following year, New Zealand hosted, and they had an implementation plan, the Aotearoa Plan of Action. Both of these initiatives together really defined for sort of the next period of time what APEC does. It works on trade and investment. That's one of the economic drivers. It works on innovation and digitalization, and it works on strong, secure, sustainable, inclusive, and balanced growth as a third economic driver, and we'll talk more about that. And then last year, Thailand hosted, and we were coming out of the COVID pandemic, but then we had Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which complicated a lot of our negotiations in APEC, because of course Russia is also a member, as you saw from the map. These are the kind of the last 3 years worth of progress, and I would highlight that in the Thailand year, last year, Thailand worked to launch something called the Biocircular Green Economy, which I think is really exciting because it embeds sustainability principles across all of APEC's work streams. And we'll talk about some of those work streams in a minute, but that's something that we really want to build on in our own host year to focus on environmental and sustainability objectives. So the White House volunteered to host APEC in late 2021 when Vice President Harris visited the region. In the course of a typical planning cycle for APEC, that was very, very late in the process. But there wasn't another volunteer at the time for 2023. We decided to step in and do it, and we see hosting APEC as an integral piece of the prosperity pillar of President Biden's Indo-Pacific strategy, which was launched in early 2022. So despite this very, very short runway that we've had available to us to prepare to host events of this magnitude, we've got now plans to host meetings in 5 different cities across a 12-month period. We've already had 2 of those sets of meetings, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But all of it includes a leaders summit, 10 ministerial meetings, 4 senior officials meetings, and nearly 300 workshops and working level events, as well as the stakeholder engagements that I've been talking about. So we want to use this APEC opportunity really to leverage, for both foreign policy and domestic policy gains, and advance an international economic prosperity that boosts, international economic policy that boosts prosperity both at home and in the region. And, we want to be a good steward of APEC. We want to be leaders in a multilateral organization, and we want to build on the 3+ decades of APEC's success. So our theme for this year is creating a resilient and sustainable future for all as we aim to build an interconnected, innovative, and inclusive Asia-Pacific region. So this theme, we feel like, builds very much on the work of APEC, especially the last few years, but also hopefully delivers some of the results the region needs right now as we come out of the COVID pandemic and really look at how we can boost growth moving forward. So I'm not going to read off the slide. You guys can take a look at that. But to flesh out the agenda a little bit more, we started to bracket our various work streams in APEC, most of which are existing work streams, into this interconnected, innovative, and inclusive goal. So building a resilient and interconnected region that advances broad-based economic prosperity includes all the things that you see up on the board. And I think the point I would emphasize, and I had to learn a lot about this when I first came on board last year, is that there's just a massive number of lines of effort across all the APEC committees, working groups, et cetera. And so what we really want to do is be able to bring all of this together into some broader, some bigger outcomes that we can announce at the end of our host year and agree to with all the other APEC economies. So secondly, enabling an innovative environment for a sustainable future. This issue is not just about some of the digital economy priorities, but it's also about how can we use technology to really address the climate crisis, advance environmental protection, and try to build a more sustainable future. And so again, across a whole range of things, whether it's food security, disaster risk, climate mitigation, et cetera, we want to try to address all of these points. And then finally, affirming an equitable and inclusive future for all, which I mentioned a moment ago. Women's economic empowerment is a major issue in APEC. But another issue that's big for the region is promoting small and medium-sized enterprises. We also see an intersection there because you have a lot of small companies owned by women that have faced a lot of challenges, particularly during the pandemic around the region. But inclusivity obviously covers a whole range of different underrepresented groups as well, and we want to make sure that we have an agenda that does, address issues of concern for workers, issues of concern for minority populations, and issues of concern for some of those populations around the region that don't have typically the same kind of economic opportunity in their economies. So for each of all the lines of effort that on the slides, there are multiple engagements and policy initiatives planned throughout the year to aim for progress in each area. So I've talked a little bit about the calendar, but there it is visually. And this, again, is what our team has had to work very hard over the last, I'd say, 8 months to really put together. We work in tandem with all the other agencies. We work with the White House. We work with our protocol team at the State Department. But hosting meetings across the United States in 5 cities, and I could talk about why we selected these 5, but Honolulu, Palm Springs, Detroit, Seattle, and San Francisco were the 5 that we landed on. And so almost immediately on the heels of last November's APEC Leaders Week in Bangkok, at the end of Thailand's host year, just a few weeks later, we hosted the informal senior officials meeting in Honolulu from December 7th to the 9th. That was a great place to start off our host year because that's where we had held the leaders meeting in 2011. So it's kind of starting off, where we had left off, and highlighted a couple of those key areas from our 2011 host year, including women's economic empowerment and green growth. And the Hawaii program also featured a public-facing symposium, in order to really remind us why we were hosting APEC in the first place. That we want to make sure that it benefits Americans as well as communities across the Asia-Pacific region. And it was very evident through that first meeting that hosting APEC really isn't worth anything if we're not supporting or listening to our communities and our constituents and our people. And we carried that spirit forward to the first senior officials meeting and related meetings in Palm Springs in February, during which we welcomed more than 1,300 delegates from around the APEC region from the 21 member economies to participate in meetings on a wide range of topics across a 2-week period. That also include the APEC Finance and Central Bank Deputies meeting. And so in plenary and committee meetings and workshops and bilateral discussions, we were feeling pretty good. APEC members expressed pretty broad support for the U.S. host year. particularly our focus on implementation of some of the things that have been agreed to in the last few years, like the Putrajaya Vision, the Ultra Plan of Action, and the Biocircular Green Economy. So we'll hold the first of 10 ministerial meetings, the APEC Transportation Ministers meeting in May in Detroit, and then followed right immediately thereafter by the ministers responsible for trade, also in Detroit. So we'll have Transportation Secretary Buttigieg hosting the Transportation Ministers meeting, and then U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai hosting the Trade Ministers meeting. So we're excited about that. And in these meetings, ministerial meetings, we'll attempt to lift up the efforts of APEC's working groups, be responsive to stakeholders, and drive forward on specific outcomes through negotiations of ministerial meeting statements, all with an eye toward the APEC leaders meeting and what we want to announce there in November. And then in August, our APEC host year will shift to Seattle, and you see there's 6 ministerial meetings on the docket. The Disaster Resilience Forum hosted by FEMA, the Food Security Ministerial hosted by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the high-level meeting on health and the economy hosted by HHS, the Women in the Economy Forum is ministerial level hosted by the State Department, the Small and Medium-Sized Enterprise Ministerial hosted by Commerce, and then the Energy Ministerial hosted by DOE. And Seattle also will give us a perfect backdrop to focus on digital economy issues, and we want to work closely with industry stakeholders there to highlight possible APEC initiatives and outcomes in that area. But most observers, including even the most enthusiastic APEC watchers, will not really focus their attention on the organization until the APEC Economic Leaders Week, which will be held in San Francisco during the week of November 12th. And during that week, you'll have the concluding senior officials meeting, you'll have the APEC ministerial meeting, which is foreign ministers and trade ministers, you'll have a finance ministerial meeting, you'll have the leaders meeting, and then in parallel, you'll also have the APEC Business Advisory Council will meet, and the CEO Summit will take place. Again, a number of stakeholder engagements around the Bay Area. Our goal for November will be to deliver an ambitious set of economic policy outcomes, as I said earlier, to meet the moment we're in. And these tangible outcomes are still a work in progress, but hopefully will be positive as we head into November after another 6 months of diplomacy or so in these multilateral meetings. We'll not only need to deliver on specific priorities, but we'll also have to really aim to deliver on cross-cutting objectives related to improving sustainability and inclusion, developing the digital economy, and ensuring economic resilience across the APEC region. So I'm going to almost stop talking so we can get to your questions. But we really do, Sue Koo from our team who's here, she's really our stakeholder engagement lead and has really been putting together a program called APEC Connect to really, we want to get out and connect what we're doing in APEC with a lot of different stakeholders around the United States, which is why we're really happy to be at SAIS today. But I'm really looking forward in the discussion and the Q&A to all your questions and answers and your comments and any other area where you want to push us a little bit. Everybody here, you're all an opinion leader one way or another, and we really do value your input, including ways in which you think perhaps APEC could be strengthened. We would encourage you to follow us along on LinkedIn, where we have a US APEC page and where we've been posting a lot of our activities around the country. We were on a podcast with NPR late last week. We have stuff up there from our Pittsburgh and Atlanta trips. We have stuff up there from our Palm Springs meetings and everything that we're trying to do on the stakeholder front. And we also have a web page, dedicated US APEC 2023 webpage on the State Department site. So I feel like I'm in a very fortunate position. I've been interested in this stuff for almost 30 years. I now am in a great spot to be able to come back and work as U.S. senior official for APEC during a host year. And so, I think that the time between being in your all seats as a grad student to now has kind of gone by like that. But I do think it's a great opportunity for us to be able to, again, to show some leadership, to really deliver on some outcomes, and also do what we can through APEC to uphold international rules and norms. But at the end of the day, while APEC is a great platform for diplomatic engagement, our work in APEC will only truly be meaningful if we do deliver positive outcomes. That's really ultimately what the basis on which we'll be judged. And so that is going to take some energetic diplomacy over the next 6 months, but that's really where we want to land by the time we get to November in San Francisco. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Murray. Can you hear me all right? As a moderator, why don't I ask a first question and then turn to the floor. So how do you see the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework integrating with the APEC's role in the region? Because also you mentioned at the beginning you'd like to talk about IPEF, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. So the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, when you look at the pillars that are there, there's a pillar on trade and digital trade, there's a pillar on supply chains, there's one on decarbonization, there's one on anti-corruption and tax. I think that importantly, all of those issues are issues we're also working on in APEC. So we have some similar objectives and wanting to drive forward on those issues. But obviously, IPEF is a different grouping of partners, and it also is trying to drill down a little bit more to what those partners can agree to in a negotiated way. And so, a big part of the criticism of U.S. economic policy in the region is that we're not as engaged, perhaps, as that we should be. And a lot of that, I think, comes from the withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership in early 2017. But I think what the Biden administration is trying to do is we're trying to do several different things under the prosperity pillar of the Indo-Pacific strategy to really try to enhance that engagement with different sets of partners through different mechanisms, but still at the same time trying to achieve some of the same goals. So whether that's by hosting APEC, whether that's through launching the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework talks, whether that's through working on issues in the Quad related to technology and related to infrastructure development and climate, or whether that's really working hard on a bilateral basis with partners like Korea, partners like Japan, partners like Australia in the region to really try to enhance economic engagement. And I think from the U.S. government perspective, we also have responsibility to do that because that's what our constituency, what our business community and other stakeholders really want us to do. I mean, they definitely see, the Indo-Pacific region as the most dynamic region in the world. And so they want us to have as many different opportunities as we can to really try to grow that.
Thank you. So I'll take questions. So questions? Okay, please.
Thank you for your talk. So can you just give some maybe examples of APEC in the past, like challenges that it's solved, or just and then the positive outcomes that you're looking for this year, maybe a little bit more tangibly?
And
Yep.
do you also want to introduce yourself?
I'm Dan Dutoro. I'm a second year.
Yep. No, great. It's a great question. And, I think APEC, again, it's had this sort of consensus-based, non-binding, way of doing things, which has, lended itself to certain outcomes that have been picked up and have been taken out by other international organizations. So, for example, the Trade and Services Agreement that is a WTO agreement started as an APEC outcome. Also, environmental goods and services and reducing tariffs on environmental goods and services was started as an APEC discussion in sort of 2010, 2011 during our host year and then the year that followed. And so right now as well, the Commerce Department has announced a global cross-border privacy rules system. They announced that middle of last year. That started as an APEC initiative. And so trying to either work across consensus across all 21 economies, or using APEC as a forum to really engage key partners on some of these areas, is something that we're trying to do. I think that when you look across all of our ministerial meetings, let's take the area of sustainability, for example. One of the things that we're trying to do this year is to upgrade APEC's renewable energy targets. So, for example, APEC many years ago set renewable energy targets and then announced last year that they were ahead of schedule to meet them. Of course, in the APEC context, where you have a lot of different views of what that means, some of the economies have said, "Well, that's great. We can declare victory and move on." But from the U.S. perspective and a lot of other economies' perspectives, that's then a reason to sort of strengthen those targets and really aim a little bit higher for the region. So that's an example. Also, as you look across all of our ministerial meetings, they all want to do something through APEC this year that has to do with sustainability. Department of Transportation is looking at things like green shipping lanes, which has started to be experimented with throughout the region. But if we could do that on a more region-wide basis, that would be really significant potentially. There's also, we're trying to bring together the Women in Economy Forum with the Small and Medium-Sized Enterprise Ministerial to really look at how we can lift up small women-owned businesses. So, those are a few examples. We still have a lot of work to do in terms of exactly what we're going to produce in our host year. Another one in the digital space is interest in cloud computing principles that APEC economies could agree to. So, hopefully there are specific areas where we can really have specific outcomes, so it's not just a kind of a mealy-mouthed, sort of 3-page statement that nobody cares about, but it really does deliver on some concrete things. I think the other issue that's probably, and Dr. O and I have had discussions about this in my previous job, the other issue that, of course, everybody in the United States talks about still is, thanks to COVID, is supply chains. And, if there are ways within APEC where we can really promote supply chain resiliency, and there is an action plan for doing that. But what you tend to see in APEC is a lot of agreement around the region on outcomes that are action plans, roadmaps, kind of that, the precursor, hopefully, to some very concrete agreements. But still, I think, really important sort of fabric of that kind of international engagement on economic issues, so that then we can take some of those things and build them up in other fora as well. So I think that's what success would look like for us this year, is if we can get some very concrete things, in that way.
Great, thank you. And then Shu. Xian and Shu.
Thank you for your talk, sir. My name is April Choi. I'm also a second-year MAR student at SAIS. I have 2 questions. One is regarding the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act. It's like some see it as a hindrance, or some see it as an opportunity to the trade relationships with the United States. And how do you see the IRA affecting the trade relationships with other APEC member countries? And the second one is, I've heard your interview with Ray Suarez earlier this month, and you've mentioned how the Russian invasion of Ukraine and sort of some of the recent recent actions of China sort of negatively affecting the cooperation part of APEC, and that APEC is willing to sort of push back on those parts. And I was wondering, how do you see an economic cooperation entity like APEC, not focused on political security or military security, sort of be able to push back on those issues?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, let me take the second question first. APEC does have a long history where it prides itself on being focused on the economic issues and not being focused on political issues. A lot of the challenge that we had last year with respect to Russia was there was a lot of concern about Russia's invasion as a political issue, as a humanitarian issue, but it also fundamentally was a regional economic issue. There were some very significant impacts of Russia's invasion on food security in the region, on prices, on energy security. And so, for a lot of economies' representatives, when they first heard discussion around Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and of course Russia's a member of APEC, they immediately defaulted to, well, that APEC is not the place to talk about these things. And so we had some disagreements over, ministerial statement language, and we had a lot of challenges that were related to that. But by the end of the year, by the end of last year, there was, really strong push within APEC at the leaders level to acknowledge the impact of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on the region's economy. And so we did end up with a pretty strong consensus leaders declaration in November in Thailand that really did highlight Russia's invasion and the impacts that had had. So from our perspective, we saw that as a step forward. And similarly, with China, it's very different. China will be very cooperative in certain parts of APEC, but then on certain processes will be obstructionist. And so, we really are trying to work directly with them, but also work with partners to try to move those processes forward in a multilateral setting. As I said in the podcast, really my message to China, as well as message to our partners, is that if we believe China is undermining international rules and norms, or if we believe that China is undermining APEC as an institution, then we want to push back. But nobody in APEC, none of the other partners want to be in a situation where the US and China are fighting with each other all the time, right? And that's not really what we want to be doing in multilateral setting, right? And so I've really taken on board what a lot of other of our partners have said on that, and we're really trying to be responsive in that way. But that said, there are places where China's going to take a position that we can't agree with because we believe that it's either undermining international rules and norms or undermining APEC as an institution. I think on the IRA, one of the really important things, again, we talked about supply chains a minute ago, that every single economy around the world, and certainly around the Asia-Pacific region, is trying to figure out is what's the right balance between international engagement and domestic investment on supply chains. We understand that we can't make, mine, or manufacture everything in the United States, but we also probably need to make, mine, and manufacture more in the United States, right? So when I was in my previous job as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Trade Policy, we did a lot of work with the White House and with other agencies on the supply chain executive order and trying to set what is the right balance between our international engagement and our domestic investment. And so, when I was having diplomatic discussions about supply chains, the first partner actually that I talked to at my level was Korea. And we talked about sort of what is the situation for them. And I'll always remember what my counterpart said, because he said, well, I think you've identified the right 4 key sectors in supply chains. And for that executive order, the 4 key sectors were EV batteries, semiconductors, PPE and medical supplies or pharmaceutical APIs, and then also, critical minerals. Because what my Korean counterpart said is, he's like, yes, you've identified the right 4 sectors. We have a lot of 2 of them and none of the other 2, right? And I always remember that because it takes you back. Every single economy, every single country has a different situation when it comes to supply chains. And we talk about global supply chains, but obviously supply chains are, there's multiple sectors. And then even if you talk about critical minerals, what are you talking about? You're talking about like more than 50 actual minerals. It's very difficult to really drill down on some of this. So I think, the Inflation Reduction Act was an attempt, again, by the administration to really promote domestic investment here. But then there was a lot of work that needed to be done to make sure that, our key partners, foreign partners, could also benefit from that. So, we've had an ongoing discussion with our Korean counterparts about the IRA since last summer. We were pleased to see on the 31st of March that the Treasury Department announced, rules for that, which I think our Korean counterparts were happy with, because it showed that for the EV battery supply chain, that could be within North America and with free trade partners and all of that. And then Sue and I were just down at SK Batteries outside Atlanta last week. And that was a really phenomenal visit to see the scale of that investment, $2.4 billion It takes a half a mile to walk from the beginning of the line to the end of the line, and there's 2 factories on that site. And so what they're able to do in terms of not only increasing investment in the United States, but also investing in the jobs of the future, that's something that we really want to continue to work with Korea and a lot of other partners on moving forward. And so that'll also be a part of our APEC host year, is we want to use the APEC platform as an opportunity to highlight some of the advantages of that foreign investment that comes from the region, because I think, unfortunately, there's not as much focus as there probably should be in the United States on investment from, for example, Korea in the EV battery and semiconductor space and things of that nature. So we want to do our part as well to use APEC as a platform to highlight some of that.
Okay, thank you for presentation. My name is Shu Fukuya. I'm a second year DIA student. My question is what is the strengths of the APEC compared to the other trade agreements like CPTPP and RCEP? Because in order to show the economic unity, I think the CPTPP and RCEP will be more like understandable because they are legally binding. And then, for instance, Japan is really suggesting the United States to rejoin the CPTPP whenever we met the United States government. So so I would just like your rough comments on that. Thank you so much.
Yeah. No, thanks. And I should have mentioned earlier when you were talking about specific outcomes from APEC, I mean, CPTPP started as TPP coming out of APEC. I mean, all of the members of CPTPP until recently, when the UK has applied to join, are all APEC members, and that really started out of an APEC discussion. It is very different, as you point out. CPTPP and RCEP are both free trade agreements. They both have specific market access provisions. They have chapters around labor and the environment, and different commitments that members make to make those agreements work. And currently in the United States, we're not pursuing really any free trade agreements of a similar nature. There's a couple of reasons for that. I mean, the main reason is, and this is something we always talk about at the State Department, you can't always be thinking about the international side. You got to be thinking about the domestic side too, right? Because from an international perspective, joining the CPTPP with all of the partners that are there makes a lot of sense. But from a domestic perspective, there are a lot of concerns from organized labor and other stakeholders in the United States around the impact of those kind of trade agreements on the United States. And some of that response, as you all have looked at and studied, comes from the U.S. experience with globalization and what certain communities across the U.S. perceive to be having lost jobs and things of that nature. So at the moment, we're not pursuing any kind of free trade agreements. What we hope to do, though, through APEC is find, again, what are some of the consensus-based non-binding things that we might be able to agree to. And we are having discussions about free trade agreements. We're not signing a free trade agreement, but there is a process in APEC called the Free Trade Area of the Asia Pacific, where we're having discussions with our APEC partners of, well, if we were to engage in a free trade agreement, what would be some of the things that would be important for us to capture there as a 21st century agreement around areas like labor, environment, state-owned enterprise disciplines, that kind of thing. So APEC is a completely different kind of gathering or completely different kind of mechanism than a free trade agreement would be. But we do hope that there are still ways in which, through APEC, you can build some consensus around trade facilitation, around some of the behind-the-border challenges, around some of the digital challenges, and still be able to make some progress to really strengthen the economies of the whole region for all 21 economies.
Hi, thank you for speaking with us. My name is Liam Kraft. I'm a second-year master's student. I was wondering, how do you handle the, you spoke about the balancing in terms of the message, international engagement with investing in domestic industry. I was wondering, kind of on a similar note, how do you handle the messaging for like economic restrictions that the U.S. is making for security reasons, specifically like export controls in the semiconductor industry. How do you kind of handle the messaging around actions like that while still kind of advocating for, you know, a more integrated, economically integrated East Asia?
No, this is an area that where as I look back on 25 years, the rules have kind of changed, you know, in a way in the middle of my career. Like when I first was trained on how to be an economic officer, it was all about promoting exports. And then we added promoting inward investment to that. And it was a very kind of positive, you know, looking at how to open markets. I mean, in the first 15 years of my career, I spent a lot of that time in China on the strategic economic dialogue, on other dialogues that we have with China. I spent time working on the TPP and those negotiations. And that was almost all, you know, very proactive and trying to, you know, be on the promote side, if you will, of economic engagement. I think it's really been in the last few years that we've had to look much more at the protect side of, you know, we did think about that certainly in, you know, the first couple decades of the century, but you know, I think the expectation was after China had joined the WTO in 2001 that things would all trend in a positive direction, and we would be able to just continue to promote open trade and investment and sort of go in that direction. But I think we've run into some limits of that, and a lot of those limits are the result of some of the actions, you know, China has taken, either to not follow through on some of its bilateral commitments or not follow through on some of its WTO obligations, or, you know, in recent years, certainly the increasing levels of sophistication in intellectual property theft and forced technology transfer and a lot of those things. So certainly a point of departure for the US and China came in 2017 when the Special 301 report was published to really, the Section 301 report was published to really look at, you know, a lot of the different ways, the concerns that US industry had around things that China was doing. And so now you have certainly, it's not just a promote angle to our economic relationships in the region, but there's also a protect angle, more of a national security type angle in terms of, you know, are we selling technology to China or other partners that might be used for military purposes or for that, you know, what's referred to as civ mil fusion, right? Or are, you know, we selling things that might also be replicated, stolen, you know, et cetera. So I think there's a lot more caution around that. Certainly there are private companies that feel like the scales now have been tipped too far in that direction. And we just had a meeting with one of those companies just before coming over here. But it's certainly an area where we're going to have to continue to try to get the balance right. And, you know, a lot of getting the balance right will be up to all of you as you go through the next 10, 20 years and we sort of enter a new paradigm in how we want to, you know, balance out our economic relationships. For us and for me in APEC, and why I think this work matters is because at its heart, at its core, it is about international rules and norms. So if we can continue to focus on that and focus on what our obligations are, you know, then that will, you know, hopefully ameliorate, you know, some of the more challenging situations. But we also need, you know, countries like China to be respectful of some of those international rules and norms as well. And you know, unfortunately, at least in my experience of working in China over the course of about 9 years, you know, saw a deterioration in that area, unfortunately. So that'll continue to require a lot of dialogue. I meet with my Chinese counterpart in APEC all the time to really try to make sure that we can stay in good communication. But it is, I think you've hit on, you know, the key issue that we're all going to be dealing with. But when I worked in the Bureau of Economic and Business Affairs before, you know, my boss would talk about, you know, it was promote and protect, and how that balancing act works is going to be a challenge for all of us.
Thank you. Just 2 fingers. So you mentioned deterioration throughout the 9 years. Do you think what really triggered that deterioration, if you could mention briefly in terms of China?
Well, I think there were a lot of factors, and I think that one of the things you often hear is, well, there was challenges in the U.S.-China relationship, or there were geopolitical challenges, or that kind of thing. I think, again, even though we're foreign policy professionals and you all are here studying international studies, I think a lot of times you have to look at what's happening, inside the countries and looking at the domestic situation, which I think is not something we naturally do sometimes when we think about international studies. But if you look at the China perspective, China's economy, grew pretty rapidly between 2001 and 2020. China did a great job of weathering the global financial crisis around 2010. They then had, Xi Jinping became the president. China hosted the Olympics. They hosted the World Expo. They became a much more, I think, assertive and proud and nationalistic country. And I think that, for that did impact a lot of the ways in which they looked at sort of U.S. actions or other countries' actions. I think in a lot of ways, if you look at, for example, in I think it was 2017, Korea installed the THAAD batteries on the peninsula, and China responded with economic coercion and really trying to to limit some of Korea's economic and investment opportunities. And so I think that in those kinds of cases, China was really feeling more powerful, and that was kind of playing itself out on the global stage. When you look at the United States over that same 20 years, a lot of jobs and factories and things, jobs went away, factories closed. You had some obviously political back and forth. We had a Republican administration for 2 terms, then a Democratic administration for 2 terms, then a Republican administration. So the country, pretty divided on the domestic political side, and definitely, had different views on China that evolved over time, particularly when we still felt like we were dealing with some of the same challenges in 2017, even worse in some cases than we had been dealing with in 2001, 2002. And of course, the United States hadn't completely weathered the global financial crisis in the same way. And so I think there are just a million factors. I mean, there's a PhD dissertation out there waiting, book to be written on all the different things. I don't think it was just one thing. I don't think it was just one country. I think it was a combination of factors. But I think ultimately the Trump administration, decided that it wanted to take action to respond, and that's what led to some of the tariffs, and then China retaliated, and then we did have negotiations for about a year in 2019 on what became known as the Phase 1 agreement. But unfortunately, everybody moved past that very quickly, because a couple weeks later, COVID hit China, and then about 6 weeks later, it hit the United States. And so we never really got the opportunity to see if the Phase 1 agreement could be fully implemented.
Thank you. Really excellent. Thank you so much. Questions? Nayan and the gentleman back there.
Hi, my name is Nayan Park. I'm a second-year MAR student at SAIS. Regarding the Women in the Economy Forum that will take place this August in Seattle, I'd be curious if you can provide more information on what strategies APEC and the State Department will bring. And I'd be curious to know more about if there will be representatives from indigenous groups, ethnic groups at that forum, because often groups like indigenous groups, ethnic groups are often missing or not as really represented in fora like this one. So I'd be curious to know more information about that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think one of the really key things about Women in Economy Forum, and also there's a working level group that goes with it called the Policy Partnership on Women in the Economy, which is a public-private collaboration, and they also met recently in Palm Springs. A lot of the issue is really about raising awareness on gender equity and on women's economic participation. There are also a number of studies that are promoted through the Women in the Economy Forum and through the Policy Partnership Women in the Economy. There's a number of different workshops that take place and a number of different recommendations that are also made to leaders through the APEC process. And so, it's been a great way, I think, to really highlight this issue because, unfortunately, in 2023, this is still a pretty significant problem. If you look at the OECD data on women's economic participation, for example, unfortunately, Korea ranks last. And so that's, for APEC economies, and it's not just Korea. The United States, we have challenges here as well. And then a lot of those challenges were exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. And so another issue that we're really trying to highlight this year is on the care economy and what kind of impact does that have on women in particular. And so, we really do want to use the Women in Economy Forum and the Policy Partnership Women in the Economy to drive towards the leaders meeting in large part to really highlight the issue and the importance of the issue and demonstrate at a leader's level and at a minister's level that this is something that APEC economies are very committed to, is to taking steps at home domestically to try to improve the situation. To your point about indigenous groups and other ethnic groups, that's also a really important piece, is wanting to make sure that we are not just focusing on women as underrepresented groups or women as groups that are of untapped economic potential, but also ethnic minorities, indigenous, including women in those groups. We've been really focused this year already in Honolulu and Palm Springs on highlighting challenges that indigenous groups face in the United States, because we also know that for many APEC economies, particularly in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Peru, in Mexico, there are also a lot of concerns about how can you fully integrate indigenous communities into the economy. And so we had a number of different speakers, including Native Hawaiians at our symposium in Honolulu, including several women. We also had a number of different indigenous groups, representatives come through our meetings in Palm Springs as well. So I think this is one of the ways in which we can also use a U.S. host year to really demonstrate that this is hopefully a strength in the United States, that we need to continue to work on it, but this is an area where we might be able to really demonstrate to other economies some of the ideas we have on how to make sure that we're really focused on including all underrepresented groups in the economy.
Thank you so much. So we'll take one final question, if you can make it really brief, and then we will just straight to the networking session.
Thank you for calling me in presentation. My name is Kevin, I'm first year here. So I see one of the objectives of the initiative is to support for WTO, and currently the WTO dispute mechanism is paralyzed partially due to the US. So I'm wondering what are the consensus among members to support WTO?
There is a discussion around WTO reform in APEC and wanting to look at how we can all use the multilateral trading system for shared benefit across the economies. At the Trade Ministerial in May in Detroit that Ambassador Tai is hosting, we'll also welcome WTO Director General Ngozi and several other senior WTO leaders to that meeting to have that discussion. Certainly, obviously, there are concerns around the dispute settlement mechanism. There are also a number of other concerns around the reform of the WTO and what's needed there. So we see this as hopefully another area where APEC can play a really positive role, is in bringing together these 21 economies who account for half of global trade, to also include really important discussions around how we can strengthen the WTO and strengthen the multilateral trading system. So that's definitely on the agenda for May. And then again, that whole line of effort on trade policy is works through the entire APEC year, and U.S. Trade Representative Tai will be back in San Francisco in November at the APEC ministerial meeting as well, to continue to work on a number of these issues.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Murray, for your excellent remarks and also sharing your views, experience. Really captures your 30 years of experience as a senior foreign service officer. So we really appreciate your time, and let's move to that room over there for the brief session
Sure.
for networking. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
And